If you were 2 weeks from high school graduation, what would you do? On April 20th, 1999, two 12th grade students had such an insane answer to this question that it still has the United States pondering. On that day, 17-year-old Dylan Klebold and 18-year-old Eric Harris entered Columbine High School and would stage a school shooting, an attempted bombing, arson, a shootout with police, the mass murder of a dozen students and a teacher, and would wound 24 others before finally committing a 𝕮𝖎𝖏 in the school's library. The news lost their minds.
Two gunmen burst into Columbine High School.
High school shooting tragedy in Littleton, Colorado.
Deeply troubled young people.
The shooting grabbed the headlines, knocking the war in Kosovo off of the front pages.
Parents lost their minds. Christians lost their minds.
Marilyn Manson can walk into our town and promote hate, violence, suicide, death, drug use, and Columbine-like behavior. I can say, not without a fight you can't.
High schoolers across the country lost their minds. The students even got the cover of Time magazine. No, not those students. This is America, come on. Dave Cullen. So, when tragedy strikes and a whole nation, and even the world, is looking for answers, there's always going to be someone who writes a book about it. And while there are multiple books covering the massacre, Dave Cullen's Columbine, released April 6, 2009, was at one time the most popular, winning the Edgar Allan Poe Award and topping loads of Best of 2009 book lists. Even now, it's often read in schools and universities. The book was praised for seemingly thorough research and its graphic, colorful descriptions of the massacre and the events leading up to it. Plus, the endless claim that Cullen had been studying the Columbine case for 10 years was a huge selling point. It kind of gave readers confidence in the book's accuracy. He also promoted the then revolutionary-sounding theory that Klebold and Harris weren't victims of bullying at all, as had previously been reported, but that their actions were driven by something else entirely. In his opinion, the level of bullying they received was normal.
There was lots of bullying at Columbine. It was a high school in America. Did it have anything to do with driving these two boys to murder? I cannot find any evidence of that.
Cullen also laid the prime foundations for the now infamous Dylan was a follower narrative, which basically states that the massacre was Harris's idea, and he roped Klebold into it by taking advantage of Klebold's desire to die. The heart of this theory is based on the boys' posthumous psychological profiles, where Klebold was labeled a depressive and Harris a psychopath. I'll get more into those in a bit, but for now I'll just say they aren't the most conclusive diagnoses in the world because, you know, the patients were dead. But for whatever reason, Cullen was interested in painting this picture where Klebold was a reluctant killer, a lost romantic hypergenius who was oversensitive and only wanted to kill himself, while Harris was an arrogant, manipulative, homicidal psychopath who was constantly taking advantage of people for his own gain. Even at the time it was published, Cullen's book got criticism for playing fast and loose with the facts of the case, and for a writing style that almost sounded like bullshit fanfiction at points. Just listen to this excerpt. On the ultimate high school scorecard, Eric outscored much of the football team. He was a little charmer. He walked right up to hotties at the mall. He won them over with quick wit, dazzling dimples, and a disarming smile. Said who? Exactly. What the fuck? But probably the most hilarious example of twisting facts is when Cullen describes the boys at a diversion center for juvenile delinquents. He claims that while their diversion officer was delighted with Harris and called him an easygoing man, she gave no such affectionate sign-off to Klebold. Quote, "And why wouldn't Andrea Sanchez like Eric more? Everyone did. Dylan was a gloom factory. The misery was self-fulfilling. Who wanted to hang around under that cloud all day?" What Cullen failed to mention is that there was an additional sign-off page for both boys, and Sanchez does praise Klebold, ironically for having a bizarre sense of humor that always made her laugh. Probably because of many inaccuracies like these, and its pretty faulty narrative, Cullen's book seems to be falling out of favor in more recent years. Bullied outcasts. Before Cullen's book, this is probably the first story you'd think of when you heard about Columbine. It's a pretty old storyline. The alienated and downtrodden find strength in unity and exact vengeance on those who wounded them, becoming the ultimate incarnation of everything they hated in their revenge. At least that's the story the media spun out. Add the high school element, video games, Nazism, and a million other easy scapegoats, and you have the third biggest story of the year. But was it actually true? Depending on what article you read, Klebold and Harris were either relentlessly bullied loners who had only each other as friends, or they got an average amount of bullying and were just as popular as anyone else. There's even a scattered opinion among actual staff, students, and parents of students that were there at the time. Frank 𝕮𝖎𝖓, who was a principal at Columbine for over 15 years, testified before the governor's Columbine Review Commission meeting and said that, quote, stories of a Columbine jock culture prone to bullying kids like Harris and Klebold was a myth, that there was no Trenchcoat Mafia, and that staff members didn't detect bullying or have any warning of what was to happen. Some coaches, teachers, and staff echoed these sentiments or refused to be interviewed at all. But there's a lot of testimony indicating that bullying actually was an issue. Patty Stevens, a special education teacher, said that bullying was rampant in '97 and '98, and that one of the jocks would pick on a student of hers. I saw how afraid and scared my special education kids were, she said. I mentioned it at staff meetings. I didn't get any response. They kind of blew me off. Betty Scholes, the aunt of 𝕮𝖓𝖊 Scholes, one of the murdered students, testified that 𝕮𝖓𝖊 would be harassed by the Trenchcoat Mafia, remember that name if you haven't heard it before, whom she described as, quote, a group of kids who harassed kids. They'd go down the halls harassing kids, making racial slurs, not just racial slurs, harassing people they didn't like. She also stated 𝕮𝖓𝖊 went to the principal about it, but the principal said, we don't have those problems here. Val Schnurr, who was critically wounded in the massacre, told her mother there was bullying at the school over race and religion. According to a June 1999 Washington Post article, Columbine High School is a culture where initiation rituals meant upper-class wrestlers twisted the nipples of freshman wrestlers until they turned purple, and tennis players sent hard volleys to younger teammates' backsides. Sports pages in the yearbook were in color, a national debating team and other clubs in black and white. The homecoming king was a football player on probation for burglary. Stephen Green, father of a Jewish Columbine student, recalled how in fall of 1996, a 215-pound football player named Rocky Hofsnyder and another football player harassed his son Jonathan by singing about Hitler whenever Jonathan made a basket in gym class. He said the gym teacher, Craig Place, did nothing, and when Green confronted the principal and Jonathan's guidance counselor, they said, quote, this stuff can happen. They looked at me like I was a problem. Even though Hofsnyder ended up getting charged with harassment, he was still allowed to continue his football and wrestling classes at Columbine unchallenged. Hofsnyder and a group of athletes who wore white hats began to take over the school, according to parent Cecilia Buckner, and one of them, Anthony A. Pine, taunted student Andrea Harwick about her breasts twice. When she complained to the teacher, Tom Tonelli, he told her to just get another seat. Guess what? He was also the football and wrestling coach. The Trenchcoat Mafia, a group of students who typically wore black dusters, supposedly emerged when the less orthodox, less popular crowd decided to stand up to the jocks. There would be graffiti fights in the boys' bathroom between the two cliques, where one would write "Jocks rule" and the other "Jocks suck." A teacher's aide even suggested the school council might want to consider some new guidelines to curb the bullying, but when she brought it up at a faculty meeting, she was ignored. So, Columbine is definitely sounding like a school of angels who shit rainbows and smell like sunshine.
Hey, Scotty. Jesus, man.
But how was it for Klebold and Harris specifically? Klebold and Harris met and became friends in 7th grade, and because they were often seen together, some of their other friends described them as inseparable. They were jeered at and called gay by some students. Things got even worse when they were in the gym for phys ed. Eric had a mild physical deformity, pectus excavatum, which makes your chest indent as if you were poked by a pyramid. He'd had surgery to somewhat correct it, so it probably wasn't that noticeable, but some students, especially jocks, would make fun of him over it, to the point where Eric refused to take off his shirt in the gym. One student, whose name has been redacted, said he made fun of Eric for having a big head on a skinny body, while another student, also name redacted, said he teased Eric relentlessly because he sucked at sports. Eric was apparently even held down by several students and bashed in the face with a volleyball after he won a game. Dylan Klebold also got teased in the gym. According to basically all the students there, he was tall, lanky, and badly coordinated. One student, Josh Chavez, said everyone made fun of Dylan in class and even called him Stretch because he was so tall, and a redacted student said they called Dylan the Jolly Green Giant. Apparently he was so bad at wrestling that even when he got matched with an equally scrawny kid, he still managed to lose. In his journal, Klebold wrote, The asshole from gym class, how he worries me. I think he was using the more literary definition of worry, as in he bothers me, rather than he makes me nervous. Anyway, later Klebold and Harris started bowling classes for phys ed, and they continue to get teased there for their unconventional bowling styles. Klebold, who played Little League in middle school, pitched the bowling ball like a baseball, and Harris threw it like a basketball. Just think about that for a second. Like, holy shit, you can't make this up. Jocks would push students, both male and female, into lockers and call them fags and lesbians just for talking to Klebold and Harris. They'd also barricade hallways so students would have to take detours around them, something Harris and others didn't want to submit to doing, as you can see in this video. One student called school officials, claiming that the two had brought drugs into the school just so Harris and Klebold would be strip searched and humiliated. Brooks Brown, a friend of theirs, said, quote, "Once I was smoking cigarettes with Klebold and Harris when a bunch of football players drove by, yelled insults, and threw a glass bottle that shattered near Dylan's feet. I was pissed, but Eric and Dylan didn't even flinch. Don't worry about it, man," Dylan said. "It happens all the time."
The topic Columbine was it kind of varied between the wrestlers and the football team. There was a couple of guys who were at the top, whether out of fear or out of actually being cool or whatever. There were a couple of guys that were at the top because of that. There were a couple of girls who were at the top because of their situation, how they looked, the money they had, things like that, their grade point average and how much they obeyed the teachers, all that stuff. They were the bottom two kids in the entire school, not just out of the senior class. The entire school, they were the two uncoolest kids. So they were the losers of the losers, is the way to put it.
I was pushed against a locker one day by a football player at the school, because he saw me talking to Dylan, and he asked me, why are you talking to that faggot? You dyke? He was just throwing his weight around. He was just being a jerk.
Eric and Dylan did get this every day, and we all knew it. And we all talked about it, and we laughed about it because that's all you can do.
According to Chris Morris, member of the Trenchcoat Mafia and casual friends with Harris and Klebold, Eric was picked on for being short and reportedly was depressed about his height, while Dylan was picked on for looking odd and being taller than most people in his classes. Robert Perry, remember this name, he was later suspected of being a third shooter in the massacre, said that Eric was constantly taunted, picked on, and had food thrown on him in the cafeteria. A month before the massacre, he was followed around the hall by students who taunted, "The war is over, you can go home." He yelled at them, "Shut up, assholes." The boys were allegedly physically threatened, called dirtbags and inbreeds. Student Zach Johnston recalled an incident where Klebold and Harris, who Zach's friend referred to as Rammstein boys, were walking past when Zach's friend said something derogatory about Rammstein, one of Klebold and Harris's favorite bands. Eric Harris complained, "Every day you pass me and make fun of me saying Rammstein sucks. Why do you do this shit? What did I do to you?" The friend sarcastically replied, "Oh, you're so cool, man. You're my idol." Then Dylan came forward, seemingly to back up Eric, and although Johnston said that Klebold and Harris wouldn't have a chance in a fight, he still didn't want to get into it with them because he was, quote, "afraid of things they might do afterwards." Eric was a short, clean-cut looking kid, and Dylan was a very tall, skinny guy with messed up hair. He always wore the trench coat, a hat, and dark sunglasses. The bell rang and they left, and we went into class. That was the end of the confrontation. Johnston also thought Klebold and Harris were part of the Trenchcoat Mafia. Johnston was co-workers with another member of the TCM, a kid who Johnston said also got treated badly at school. If other members of this Trenchcoat Mafia were treated like my past co-worker, then this is their only motive for doing what they did a few days ago. They were two outcast kids that were constantly made fun of, and they finally snapped. What they were thinking before they performed this horror will never be conceivable to anyone. It had nothing to do with Doom or Quake, TV or movies. It was all pain inside their heads that they couldn't deal with. Some blame parents, other students, the NRA, or whatever. No, they weren't man enough to deal with their misfortunes, so they took the easy way out. He later says, "Throughout history, people report individuals who are crazy and socially unstable. Many murders come to mind. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were two completely unstable mental cases who were bound to act as they did from the start. So go ahead, blame the guns, the lack of metal detectors, the parents, the video games, the other students, the lack of religion in schools, or whatever your fancy, whatever makes you feel better. I implore you, take it from me. Laws are made logically to protect people, but what happens when people who are not logical exist in our world? This, you cannot run from it. According to Nathan Vanderoe, there was even a shit-throwing incident.
How are the kids, let's say the Trenchcoat Mafia kids, how are they treated?
Oh, man, they got picked on pretty good. They got a cup of fecal matter thrown at them, which was disgusting.
Senior Molly Welkser said that even teachers at the high school treated 𝕮𝖆𝖊𝖊 unfairly. Quote, "You know, you could always tell who were the teacher's favorites in class, and Dylan and Eric were not one of their favorites." She also said the woman who ran the school's computer lab picked on 𝕮𝖆𝖊𝖊 unjustifiably. She said they'd glare at this woman when this happened, but wouldn't do much else. Student Alyssa Setchler said while Harris loved his German class, he hated the teacher because she picked on him, Alyssa, and another student named Christy Epling. One of Dylan's teachers allegedly referred to him as a slacker who was unattractive to his peers, which, if it's true, was one of the most hilarious and absurd teacher's notes I've ever heard of. Like, I fail to see how that's in any way relevant to teaching. So yeah, healthy school environment, loads of fun. That said, according to most sources, the boys weren't exactly outcasts. While they were picked on by some for being weird, they, and particularly Klebold, had a decent amount of friends. Robin Anderson, a senior, reportedly had a crush on Klebold and begged him to go to the prom with her. Sarah Davis, a childhood friend of Eric's, exchanged emails and letters with him up until the day of the shootings. Some were under the impression that Klebold and Harris looked and acted weird because they wanted to be different and enjoyed the notoriety it gave them. Quote, "They had no school spirit and they wanted to be different," Randy Thurman, parent of a wrestler and football player, said of the killers. "Anyone who shows any kind of school spirit, any pride in the school, they're accepted." Judy Brown, mother of Brooks Brown, mentioned this incident when Dylan was in a restaurant with his mother.
Dylan had on his coat and those glasses. And as Sue looked around the restaurant, she thought people were uncomfortable and were afraid of him. And she said, "Dylan, people are afraid of you. With that on, you need to take it off." And he just smiled at her. I think when he got this coat, it's the first time he ever felt power in his life.
So, to conclude, while the situation at Columbine was definitely not ideal, I don't know if it was that much worse than most American schools at the time. Most schools then weren't really putting their feet down when it came to harassment, and before Columbine, it wasn't that unusual for a student to sneak a gun in his locker or something like that. It was kind of a wild, wild west compared to now, mainly because of how the massacre led to policy changes and, in general, a much more paranoid and alert approach to school security. The basement tapes. Easily one of the most infamous things about the Columbine case is a series of videotapes filmed in Harris and Klebold's homes explaining the rationale and motivation behind their upcoming massacre. Dubbed basement tapes by investigators since most of them were found in Eric's basement, the videos have never been released to the public in their entirety. In fact, no actual footage from the tapes have been released to the public at all. This has led to a lot of conspiracy theories and general eye-rolling, especially because the official reason for withholding the tapes, that they'll make people sympathize with the killers or inspire copycats, rings pretty hollow in the face of Columbiners who want to have a baby with the killers, and that over 17 school shootings have already been inspired by the massacre in some way. A partial transcript of the basement tapes is easy to find online, but it's not a direct transcript, and a lot of it just summarizes the actions and words of the killers. Here are some accounts from the few people allowed to see them, and reports on the rationale behind keeping them secret.
Families of Columbine victims come to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department with a purpose: to watch the videos made by Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. It's a hard viewing to take. Some families, like that of Daniel Rohrbaugh, want a private viewing.
I'm at a loss to see what good this story was going to bring to the community or to the rest of us 2 weeks before Christmas.
But others stay to watch a condensed version of the 5 hours of tape.
It was all very bad.
Kass 𝕮𝖊𝖊's father says this image will stick with him, 2 teenagers who executed a deadly plan that could have been found out.
And moms and dads and brothers and sisters and friends needed to start taking these things seriously.
It makes me realize that we need to look deeper into the society's ills, that we're creating kids like this.
Dale Todd's son survived.
Disgusting.
He agrees society has to look deep to cure this evil.
These were 3.8 GPA kids, and their behavior is disgusting.
This latest chapter in the Columbine tragedy takes an emotional toll just before the holidays, but for families hungry to know why, some say it needs to happen. Daniel Rohrbaugh's mother still wants to see the videos, no matter the pain they will cause her.
It's going to set me back several weeks, but it is something I have to know. I mean, for my own peace of mind, I have to know. I have to see these people. Yeah. And then I'll process it, and then we'll move on from there.
Now remember, the sheriff here was ordered by the state Supreme Court to make a call on what evidence should be released or not. He says the documents are fine, but those videos is a different story. He says those so-called basement tapes of the gunman, well, releasing those could have devastating consequences.
When I first saw them, I found them very disturbing.
Jefferson County Sheriff Ted Mink says releasing the so-called Harris and Klebold basement tapes would be playing right into the killer's hands.
There was no doubt about it that they wanted to be memorialized with the release of these tapes. And certainly be a martyr to other individuals thinking about this.
The possibility of copycat crimes played heavily in Mink's decision not to release the videos.
It was a model for carrying out school shootings. It was very instructional.
Mink says the tapes make it clear that Harris and Klebold fed off each other, and those tapes could possibly encourage someone else.
If one individual is thinking about this and doesn't have a Harris or Klebold to feed off of, these tapes could be that second person.
Mink knows some victims' families had hoped to learn something from the material, but he believes the tapes offer nothing more than a call out to other troubled teens.
They even talk about their ghosts coming back after they're gone and being in video games.
We saw the basement tapes. They're tapes made in Eric's basement and Dylan's room, but it's Eric's basement essentially, so they're called the basement tapes.
The 3-hour tape has only been shown once, at the beginning of the investigation. Those who saw it were deeply affected.
That hit me in the basement tapes was the fact that Eric is running his gun, called Arlene, over a pile of pipe bombs, back and forth. And he's talking casually, and Dylan said, I believe he said, my uncle is going to be really upset. And he's talking about a Jewish holiday. And Eric says to him, you're Jewish? And Dylan says, yeah. And he starts saying, I think he starts saying half or fourth, and he starts, and then I think for a second there he thinks, Eric's going to turn on me. It's just a very strange thing. And then, I don't know, Eric says something like, wow, that's too bad.
Here are a few parts I found interesting from the transcripts. Harris complains about how many times he had to move and how he could never gain respect because he always had to start at, quote, the bottom of the ladder in each new school. Klebold is annoyed about being treated like, quote, the runt of the litter by his extended family and how his popular older brother Byron would always rip on him. Harris says he's purposely staying away from his family so, quote, there won't be any bonding and this won't be any harder to do. Later he says, quote, my parents are the best fucking parents I've ever known. My dad is great. I wish I was a fucking sociopath so I didn't have any remorse, but I do. This is going to tear them apart. They will never forget it. There's nothing you guys could have done to prevent any of this. There's nothing that anyone could have done to prevent this. No one is to blame except me and vodka. Our actions are a two-man war against everyone else. Klebold talks about how his parents taught him to be self-reliant and independent and says, I appreciate that. The boys complain about the cold weather and say, snow is gay. Klebold and Harris, quote, discuss coming back as ghosts to haunt the survivors, to create flashbacks from what we do and drive them insane, Eric tells the camera. And, probably the most infamous quote from the tapes, we are, but we aren't psycho. A brief excerpt of the basement tapes was leaked by Daryl Scott at a victim's press conference around Christmas 1999. Now, a lot of people think the basement tapes should be released already, that everything truly disturbing related to Columbine has already been released, and that there can't be anything on the basement tapes so horrible that the public shouldn't be allowed to see them. But according to the FBI, they are that dangerous. Here's what they had to say in their official statement regarding them. Quote, "The tapes could be viewed by some as a call to arms. Harris and Klebold characterize their situation as war and exhort others to commit similar acts. The tapes are instructional and provide their audience with blueprints for this lethal school shooting. They provide guidance as to obtaining, concealing, and transporting weapons. They allow the viewer to identify personally with the shooters, hearing and seeing what they were experiencing and feeling in the time virtually leading up to the morning of the shooting. What they report experiencing appears as if it is thrilling and empowering for them. The content of their discussions are dynamic and extreme in tone, but tempered in emotion, while Harris and Klebold appear to fuel each other's violent fantasies as they ratchet up their rhetoric, enthusiasm, and commitment to their intended plans for violence. Neither of them engages in what could be considered maniacal ranting and raving. They do not appear to be psychotic or delusional. There is no evidence either Harris or Klebold is experiencing hallucinations. They appear to be oriented in place and time. They do not appear to be intoxicated or under the influence of drugs, even though they appear at times to take sips from a bottle of whiskey. They do not slur their words, appear forgetful or lethargic. They discuss their intended violence and the justification for this violence in a lucid, coherent, persuasive, and logical manner. Their presentation style and the content of their discussions are a powerful combination which very likely will make an impact on some adolescents. Throughout the videotapes, Harris and Klebold can appear articulate, mature, intelligent, witty, and even insightful to the target audience. The messages in their conversations are clear and direct. At times, they look directly into the camera and talk to the viewer. Some who view these tapes could feel that they are actually part of these discussions. Harris and Klebold personalize their discussions with the viewer while emphasizing or explaining a particular point. This third-party involvement in the conversations makes these tapes even more compelling. Their discussion of violence and killing others, together with their rationalizations and justifications for this behavior, are done with a unique style of dark humor, which could be appealing to vulnerable adolescents. Harris and Klebold appear to enjoy being in front of a camera discussing their feelings and intended actions. However, there is a noticeable absence of any reality check between them, and there is no tempering or questioning of each other's extreme ideation and plans for violence. Harris and Klebold's perception of the finality of their intended actions, including their own deaths, appears distorted and unrealistic. They joke about remaining around as ghosts to haunt the living or becoming actual players within a violent video game. Death is glamorized and fantasized as a positive alternative to a life they describe as pure hell on earth. This message could certainly resonate with other adolescents experiencing suicidal as well as homicidal ideations. Harris and Klebold make a very prophetic proclamation that, because of their actions, they will be remembered forever. Seeking attention and fame are two of the commonly noted motivators for school shootings. Therefore, the idea that one could achieve a similar degree of infamy even after death could also inspire others. Eric Harris specifically talks about not having to worry about his future, final exams, going to college. This freedom from worry about the future is also a theme that other similar thinking adolescents could relate to because of their personal experiences with adolescent stressors and anxieties. The fact that these messages will be presented by the most successful school shooters in U.S. history, now essentially from the grave, would give them an additional macabre degree of influence. This aspect could be particularly problematic with the potential lone shooter who, having lacked a partner to his schemes and fantasies, now has found a surrogate partner in the tapes. It is the opinion of the BAU that if these tapes are released, it is inevitable that they would immediately become available to any person through the internet or other forms of mass communication. There would be no control or ability to monitor the impact of these tapes on those individuals, particularly adolescents who are vulnerable, angry, depressed, isolated, and/or contemplating similar acts of violence. Once released, these tapes could be modified for any purpose the viewer might have, and repeated exposure to them in part or in whole could be sufficient to influence someone looking for the knowledge, justification, or encouragement to act out violently. Now, is it just me, or is an assessment like this literally just making the basement tapes seem more powerful and alluring than they probably actually are? It's like they almost want them to have this mythological status. Just doesn't make sense to me. But anyway, the FBI allegedly destroyed the tapes in 2011, though most people agree that there still existing copies that may just never see the light of day. Marilyn Manson. After Columbine, people were desperate to figure out what could have caused two seemingly nice kids from the suburbs to blast their school to pieces, and at the forefront of loads of media blamed for Klebold and Harris's actions was Marilyn Manson, one of the most shocking rock acts of the day. He'd already been courting controversy on purpose, but even he drew the line at being blamed for a school shooting.
I definitely can see why they would pick me, because I think it's easy to throw my face on a TV, because I'm, in the end, sort of a poster boy for fear, because I represent what everyone's afraid of, because I do and say what I want.
If you were to talk directly to the kids at Columbine or the people in that community, what would you say to them if they were here right now?
I wouldn't say a single word to them. I would listen to what they have to say, and that's what no one did.
Manson canceled some parts of his tour out of respect after the tragedy, and most people who weren't die-hard Christians or frightened moms sympathized with his position. The argument that art inspires violence is a very old chicken or the egg type argument that's been raging for hundreds of years, though I'd say anyone with an ounce of artistic leaning or who enjoys anything fun generally agrees that people's decisions are their own and you can't blame art as the main driving factor. Besides, contrary to media reports, the killers were likely not even fans of Manson's music at the time of the massacre, and in fact may have held Manson in contempt. Harris in particular thought he was a corny poser. As for Manson, his class in handling the situation helped his reputation, as it showed he had a depth of character that people who weren't his fans hadn't seen before, though ironically in later years he would blame the controversy for his lagging career and rapidly dropping record sales. Doom. Another scapegoat of the Columbine massacre was good old video games. It wouldn't be the first time violent video games were blamed for acts of juvenile delinquency, and certainly not the last. And while all video games the killers liked came under fire, for example, 1992's Mortal Kombat, none got attacked more than Doom, which was infamously a special favorite of Eric's. He references it all the time in his journals and on his website, and made his own WODs, or levels. He says the massacre will be like the LA riots, the Oklahoma bombing, World War II, Vietnam, Duke Nukem, and Doom all mixed together. He even suggests in his notes, "I have a goal to destroy as many as possible, so I must not be sidetracked by my feelings of sympathy, mercy, or any of that. So I will force myself to believe that everyone is just another monster from Doom, like FH or FS or demons, so it's either me or them. I have to turn off my feelings." You can just imagine what the media did with that.
Oh my god, Doom turned off his emotions, it's mind control. We've got to save the children from these evil video games.
Predictably, the shooter's love of Doom was plastered all over the media, and the game, which was already mired in controversy for being a pioneer in first-person shooters, a genre known for its violence, became even more controversial. And the media wasn't the only one blaming games. In 2001, families of victims slain in the massacre sued 11 video game companies, claiming that violent video games were the match that lit the fuse of the boys' already volatile personalities. One of the companies sued was ID Software, creator of Doom. The federal judge dropped the cases, as video games aren't subject to the same product liability laws as CEOs or business owners. But of course it didn't end there. Scholars flocked in with theories of a correlation between the boys' alleged addiction to violent video games and the massacre. Professor Craig Anderson of Iowa State University and Senator Brownback of Kansas even testified at a 2000 Congress meeting to try to prove violent video games had more of an effect on behavior than violent films and literature. But all the drama just threw even more popularity to the already well-loved Doom. Just days after the massacre, lots of fans, of Doom that is, were downloading and critiquing Harris's WODs, and in general, Doom was already too successful to be overshadowed by one of its more infamous players. So while I'm guessing most Doom players probably know something about Harris, it's not like he's the first thing that shows up when you research the game or think about it. 0 Hour.
I know we're gonna have followers, because we're so fucking godlike. I mean, we're not exactly human. We have human bodies, but we've evolved one step above you fucking human shit. I mean, we actually have fucking self-awareness.
Probably the most famous screen recreation of the massacre is an episode of 0 Hour called Massacre at Columbine High. It's pretty much a play-by-play of the massacre in real time, featuring interviews with survivors and excerpts from Klebold and Harris's journals. The most famous scene from it is probably this. There's a couple of inaccuracies, like Harris using a Caltech sub 2000 instead of a high point 995, but it's pretty good compared to other fictionalized accounts like the embarrassing I'm Not Ashamed.
What's your problem?
What?
I know you did that.
Did what?
I didn't stop your stupid Jesus speech. You think you're better than us?
No. No, I'm not better than anybody.
Oh, I know you're not.
I gotta get to class.
You're just like all the others. Compassion. Yeah, that'll work.
Jeff Kass. Around the same time as Dave Cullen, author Jeff Kass also wrote a book about Columbine. It's generally considered to be more fact-based than Cullen's book, but it's also a lot more bland to some. It features a lot of interviews with friends, relatives, and other people who knew Harris and Klebold, as well as evidence from police reports, medical and school records, and other case files. One mild controversy about the book is how invasive Jeff Kass was in getting information from his sources. Following Wayne Harris, Eric's father, into a urinal for instance to ask him questions, or digging up an old psychological profile on Sue Klebold, Dylan's mother, from a book her former psychologist had written. Reporters, man. Anyway, next to Dave Cullen's book, Jeff Kass's is probably the best known book on the massacre, and is often considered one of the definitive sources for information. NBK. NBK, short for Natural Born Killers, was the code name Klebold and Harris used for their massacre. This choice of name was likely Klebold's idea, as he mentions it earliest in his journal on February 2nd, 1998. He writes, "Soon, either I'll commit suicide, or I'll get with redacted name, and it will be NBK for us." He and Harris were big fans of Quentin Tarantino's Natural Born Killers, a 1994 film about lovers who go on a killing spree and end up glorified as celebrities by the media. Man, like that would ever happen in real life. Klebold originally fantasized about going MBK with the love of his life, which would emulate the film more closely. It seemed to be his belief that fate would link him with a girl who knew about his plans, and they'd essentially be like Bonnie and Clyde, dying together in their exploits. But fate never sent him the girl. Surprise, surprise, and as we all know, NBK IRL was done by Klebold and Harris. Eric writes about a desire to kill and destroy things, but his journal begins later than Klebold's and doesn't refer to MBK specifically until April of 1998, though he does mention natural selection in his first entry. If you didn't know, natural selection was kind of Eric's slogan during the massacre and in the months leading up to it. Whose idea it was to actually stage a massacre, regardless of name, is a subject of endless debate, with both the Dylan was a follower and Eric was a follower theories going back and forth. Who manipulated the other? Who was more violent? Who was the real psycho? But I don't know. Who cares? They both liked the idea. They went through with it with pretty much equal enthusiasm, and they both blew their fucking heads off. Sounds pretty mutual to me, but hey, that's just my opinion. Back to NBK the film though. While obviously it isn't the cause of the massacre, most likely Dylan and Eric would have done what they did regardless, you can see some of its influence in their actions. The underlying theme of Natural Born Killers is making a statement against a society that glorifies and rewards violence. It's a bit corny and over the top, and the commentary isn't that original, but you get the sense that Mickey and Mallory, the husband and wife from the film, are murdering for some greater purpose, sending a message, like when they kill a news reporter for his selfishness and insincerity.
Is it really worth it?
Was what worth?
Was massacring all those people worth being separated from your love for the rest of your life?
You mean was an instant of my purity worth a lifetime of your lies, Wayne?
Please explain to me, where's the purity that you couldn't live without in the 52 people who are no longer on this planet because they met you and Mallory? What's so f***ing pure about that? How do you do it?
You'll never understand, Wayne. You and me, we're not even the same species. I used to be you, then I evolved. From where you're standing, you're a man. From where I'm standing, you're an ape. You're not even an ape, you're a media person. Media is like the weather, only it's man-made weather. Murder, it's pure. You're the one who made it impure. You're buying and selling fear. You say why? I say, why bother?
Are you done? Great. Then let's cut the BS and get real. Why this purity that you feel about killing? Why, for Christ's sake, why? Don't lie to me!
I guess, Wayne, you just gotta hold that old shotgun in your hand and it comes clear like it did for me the first time. That's when I realized my one true calling in life.
And what's that, Mickey?
Shit, man. I'm a natural born killer.
Did you get that?
Eric and Dylan also wanted to send a message. They wanted the massacre to be something revolutionary, the start of something much bigger, with a deep meaning behind it. They kind of got what they wanted in a way. The massacre definitely has its own twisted legacy, for lack of a better word, but their philosophies were confused, to put it mildly, as you'll see for yourself when we get to their journals in Layer 2. The hit list. If you're a member of the Mafia, or a gang, or if you're just one evil motherfucker, what do you do when you feel slighted? You make yourself a hit list, and you actually plan to have the people on it killed. The Columbine Massacre is infamous for having multiple hit lists associated with it, some written by Harris, others by Klebold. Two of the most infamous shit lists, likely named as an ode to MBK, which also had shit lists, were found in their bedrooms and had over 30 redacted names each. So, who made it onto the lists, and why? Because everyone on the list was interviewed by police, some targets have been pretty accurately identified despite the redactions. Some of them had had run-ins with Klebold and Harris before. Sophomore Dan Labb was on Eric's list, and according to student Christy Epling, in 1998 he'd punched Eric in the face after they got into some type of insulting argument. Football player Brandon Larson was also on Eric's list, though he said he was away from the school on the day of the shootings and said he had no clue why he was on the list as he thought things were fine between him and Eric. But both Dylan and Eric appear to have hated him, and Dylan even talks about stabbing him with a knife on the basement tapes. Side note about Klebold, the guy apparently loved knives. A student interviewed by police claimed he had a fetish for knives, and Dylan's older brother Byron also said Dylan had a collection of knives. Klebold had a pocket knife and would cut himself with it, once carving some symbol for fate into his hand. During the massacre, he reportedly even said, "We should start knifing people, that'd be fun," though some attribute this phrase to Eric. At the time, Klebold was straddling the leg of a girl he used to sit in front of in government economics while he reloaded his gun on the table above her. She was terrified that because she was wearing shorts and most of her legs were bare, they would start cutting her, but they didn't. Anyway, back to the hit list. Nick Baumgart, who used to be friends with Klebold and Harris, somehow got on their bad side to the point where Eric openly insulted him on his website and his name ended up on one or both of their hit lists. Reportedly, they thought he was weak and spineless, and they didn't like the way he laughed. Student Ryan Walda was curious about the words on a shirt Dylan used to wear almost every day, so he asked him what it meant. Dylan explained it meant where cool hackers hang out, and that he wore it because he was in an AIM group called Punters and Progz. It was the only interaction Walda remembered having with Dylan, but his name ended up on Dylan's hit list for unknown reasons. Let's take a brief detour from the insanity and delve for a second into this shirt of Klebold's, which he designed and got printed himself, as you've probably seen it before in the footage, and it actually has a pretty interesting story behind it. Klebold had been into computer science since he was a kid. He built his own PC in the 10th grade, was a beta tester for Microsoft, and even got in trouble for hacking the combinations to lockers in his school. I say hacking with quotes because most likely it wasn't so much that Klebold was a hacking genius, but more that the code in the school's website was shit. And guess what else was shit back then? AOL. Security breaches all over the place, and basically all your personal information, including bank and credit card files, being logged without really being taken care of. It was so easy to hack AOL that programs started coming out to make the hacking easier. Stuff like 𝕮𝖊𝖊, whose 17-year-old creator said he made to have 20,000 plus idiots using AOL to knock people offline, steal passwords and credit card information, and to basically annoy the hell out of everyone. I should also add that he was pretty pissed that while AOL would crack down hard on things like pirating, they would basically do nothing about the pedophilia going on in their chat rooms. Sound familiar? Yeah, some things never change. So now you might be asking yourself, then what the hell are punters and progz? A punter, or an instant message bomber, would generate thousands of spam messages to a target user, completely overloading their system and basically forcing them offline. Progz was a slang term for hacking programs like 𝕮𝖊𝖊. So in a nutshell, hacking AOL wasn't hard, and if he had good progz, even an 8th grader could do it. So when Dylan writes, AOL, where the cool hackers are, in leet speak, he's being sarcastic. AOL is not where the cool hackers are, or were. It's where basically anyone can be a hacker because it sucks. It's actually a pretty cool shirt, but you know, he had to go and ruin it. Now where were we? Oh yes, the hit lists. Interestingly, they weren't totally private. At least Eric's list wasn't. But then again, Eric pretty much made lists for everything and was well known for having anger issues, so it's not surprising that his got out. Christy Epling, the girl from his German class, exchanged notes with him in school where he mentioned how Dan Lab, the kid who punched him in the face, is now down to 90 on his hit list. Do you want me to be nice to him? Eric asks Christy. She says, he never wanted you to be nice to him, he just didn't want you to kill him. He's definitely scared of you. Well, if he will let me punch him in the face and not tell a single authoritative figure, not get me in trouble, then I will be happy. I'll even fucking say hi to him when he's with you. He'll go down to around 90 on my shit list, which is basically neutral. His friend is another story though. This friend Eric is talking about is speculated to be Brendan Larson. I'll tell him, but I don't know. Redacted is a dork. I don't give a shit about him, so you can do what you wish to him. Eric, oh, we will. I don't expect Redacted to let me do that either, so until he does, not a damn thing will change. Christy, you and Dylan? Eric, yeah. Christy, that's cool. It'll probably be the same way it was. Eric, I just don't want the little fuck going to the admin or the cops and start whining that we are threatening him or intimidating him. Because if I get in any more trouble with cops, I will fucking lose it. Now, obviously just because people knew about the hit lists doesn't mean they knew what was going to happen. Most hit lists made in high school are just hyperbole. You don't like those kids, it's not a death note. Still, it does seem kind of bizarre in hindsight given how things panned out. Kinda feels like Eric, and probably Dylan, were just walking around casually with a hit list of dozens that people knew about, and everyone was just like, okay. One famous myth about Columbine is that Klebold and Harris only shot people who were on their hit lists, when in actuality, only a few who got shot, Austin Eubanks for example, are confirmed to have been on the list. Another myth is that the only people on the list were jocks and bullies. While a lot of jocks and athletes were on the list, including a football player who played with Eric's older brother Kevin, there were also non-athletes and just ordinary kids on the list, as well as people who had no contact with Eric and Dylan at all, at least not that it's been reported. At the end of the day, it doesn't seem like the hit lists were necessarily the hugest indicator of who they wanted to kill. They kind of just wanted to kill everyone. Their ultimate goal was to destroy the entire school. The Trenchcoat Mafia. Chances are you couldn't get far in watching news coverage on the massacre without hearing Trenchcoat Mafia a couple hundred times. They've even come up here a few times already. The media was quick to jump on this group of kids by associating them with Klebold and Harris, who wore the black dusters that were trademark of the TCM. But while Harris and Klebold knew about the TCM and seemed to like them, you can see them shout them out in some of their yearbooks. And Eric even wrote a whole school assignment featuring a clique of the same name. But Eric and Dylan weren't part of the clique. Not only that, while the TCM may have looked dark, they didn't really engage in activities any more devious than other students at Columbine. They were more gamers and computer geeks. They were also slightly older than Harris and Klebold. Most of them had graduated by 1999, and the ones who hadn't were no longer wearing trench coats.
In a yearbook photo of some group members that was broadcast nationwide, neither gunman appeared. One member of the Trenchcoat Mafia, John Savage, said there was a good reason for their absence.
Eric and Dylan were not at all a part of the things that we did as a group. They didn't hang out with us. They weren't Trenchcoat Mafia at all.
And he says the media's description of him and his friends had little basis in fact.
The Trenchcoat Mafia was like, we were video game nerds. We like, sit around the table and, play Dungeons and Dragons, which is just about the least dangerous thing you could do.
Chris Morris is probably the most notorious member of the TCM, not only for being friends with Eric and Dylan, but for being aggressive and violent, reportedly even bringing knives to school. He also made it clear he hated Columbine High, though he was far from the only one. When the massacre happened, he was even reported as one of the shooters by some of the witnesses and got arrested and questioned, though it was ultimately determined that he had nothing to do with it. In fact, Chris actually wasn't even at the school during the massacre, and heard about it on TV while at his friend and fellow TCM member Corey Fearson's house. Morris instantly had a hunch of who the shooters were and called the cops.
That's What is your emergency?
I'm calling again. I've called once. I need a detective to call me. I know the exact names of the persons who did it, and I know exactly what they look like,
Okay.
exactly where they live.
We have deputies that are handling that. Can I get your name?
Yeah, it's Chris Morris. I've already called once. As soon as they can, because I know exactly what they look like. They can find them like that if they're outside of the school.
Okay, hang on just a second for me.
Okay.
And it's Chris?
Chris Morris, yeah.
Morris.
Yeah.
Okay. What's your phone number, Chris?
Hello? Yeah, this is Sergeant Baldwin. I know exactly what their names are, and I've heard them talk about it once before. I know them. I thought they were my friends.
Okay.
One of them is named Dylan Klebold.
We got him. How do you spell his last name?
I think it's K-L-A-B-B-O-L-D.
K-L-A. Spell it again for me.
I think it's K-L-A-B-B-O-L-D. I'm not sure exactly.
Klebold. Okay.
And the other one's Eric Harris.
Okay.
They usually wear black trench coats. One of them, I believe, has an AK-47.
Okay.
And another one has a shotgun, 10 gauge, I believe. Another one has a handgun.
Okay. Are there three of them or just two of them?
I believe they have those three weapons, and I believe it's only those two because I hang out with them, and I've never heard about this.
Did they tell you what they were going to do?
We evacuees out of school by SWAT. Ended up over at Haley in Yukon. We're going back to get them, and we got to get them back out. I thought they were kidding around.
Happy you're not the Haley in Yukon at
By all the reports and everything, what I've heard from other students, it's got to be them.
Shotgun and a handgun.
I believe so. I believe they might have a AK-47 too.
Okay. You gave my dispatcher your name and phone number?
Yeah, I gave the name and phone number that I'm at.
We'll probably be coming in contact with you. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Here's an interview with Chris Morris and Frierson about Eric and Dylan, and also about Chris's arrest.
When I look back at it now, there's quite a few things I could have picked up and said, if I had put them all together, I probably could have figured out they were going to do something. I mean, the fact that they liked explosives, the fact that they liked guns, the fact that they had a lot of hatred towards people in the school.
Chris Morris probably spent as much time with the two killers, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, as anyone else in that last year of their lives.
It's so hard to even think about everything that's happened, because these were two people I thought I knew that I actually seem to know nothing about, and it's hard for me to understand, even.
Now Chris sees everything in that final year differently, starting with a visit the year before the shooting to this seasonal fireworks stand. Chris, Eric, Dylan, and another friend, Corey Friesen, who graduated from Columbine 2 years earlier, helped close down the stand. In return for their work, they got fireworks.
It was a lot of fireworks. I think Eric and Dylan took about 8, maybe 10 of those boxes, and so they had a large amount of fireworks.
You know, and when we got as many as we did, they were like just ecstatic that, you know, we'd walked out of there with so many like huge boxes just full of fireworks.
As their senior year began, Eric and Dylan complained more about the jocks and the culture at Columbine. Corey remembers Eric threatening to blow up the school.
You could just see it in his eyes. You just get a cold glare in his eyes and say, one of these days, I swore I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna do it. And it's like, come on, you know, lighten up a little bit.
I think Dylan on one occasion did say, wouldn't it be kind of fun to sit on the soccer field and shoot at the school? And, like, shooting out on the windows would be kind of fun. And, you know, everybody at the table there, you know, they kind of laughed a little. We thought he was all joking.
Chris and Corey say they know these statements sound horrible in the aftermath of the killings, but at the time, they didn't think of telling their parents, let alone the police. To them, it was just Eric and Dylan's twisted humor.
Here you are, my good friend Dylan, almost halfway to school. What's up?
How is it that their parents did not know? Chris says the little Eric and Dylan revealed to their friends they expertly hid from their parents.
Ready to torpedoes, mister.
I mean, Eric must have done a very good job of hiding his things, though, because his parents did search his room occasionally.
In fact, Chris and Corey say Eric told them his father did find a pipe bomb.
And Eric's like, yeah, did you hear? My dad found a pipe bomb. I'm like, oh man, that's gotta suck. I was like, you know, I figured, you know, he was gonna be in like some really big trouble.
All his punishment was to go up to the mountains with his dad and blow it up.
But to this day, the Harrises have not commented on any of the events related to Columbine. Several months prior to the shooting, there was something more Eric couldn't hide: his ever-changing moods.
I would say he actually did change over the year before the Columbine incident.
When he'd hit some mood swings, he'd really get, you know, just just that intense glare in his eyes.
Apparently, his parents noticed too, and he was prescribed an antidepressant.
And towards the end, I had been told that he actually stopped taking his medication. And sometimes it was almost frightening to see 1 minute how he was a very nice, happy, normal guy, and the next minute he was very, very angry, almost sinister at times.
But only a week before the incident, nothing seemed to be bothering the two. In fact, Chris says, Dylan was very excited about going to college, and Eric also had plans.
I remember Eric talking about the future. I remember Eric talking about him he wanted to go to school, and he wanted to get some degrees in computers, and he wanted to work on computers and make games for a living.
On April 20th, 1999, the day of the killings at Columbine, Chris finished his classes early and headed to Corey's house.
Me and Corey both started to get very angry because they said the people in the school doing it were wearing trench coats. And at that point in time, the only people who still wore trench coats in that school were Eric and Dylan. Everybody else stopped wearing them. And right away, I just had a feeling that it was them.
Chris says he desperately tried to reach the police to offer his help. He thought if he could talk to Eric and Dylan, maybe he could stop them. But instead, the police picked him up and treated him like a suspect.
They put me in handcuffs, put me in the back of a car, took me down to the park where they had everything set up, and they did a gunpowder test on me and some other tests on my skin to make sure that I didn't have any powders or residues on me.
Were you in the building?
Several law enforcement agencies questioned him throughout the next few weeks. Among the many questions, why wasn't he at school at the time of the shooting?
The police found it very interesting that I had skipped my 4th-hour class that day. They thought it was a very large deal, but if they had looked at my attendance record, they would have seen, oh wait, he skipped this class for the last month.
The police weren't the only ones suspicious. Chris says he was discouraged from returning to school, kicked out of his home by his mother, and fired from his job.
I blame Eric and Dylan. I blame them for what happened. Nobody else is at fault for what happened but them. And I truthfully wish they had been caught. I wish they hadn't have killed themselves. I wish they had been caught. And I wish that they had been able to go to jail for the rest of their lives for what they did.
They were just two troubled kids who just couldn't find any other way to, deal with everything that was going on.
Eric and Dylan were goths. Tying into the rumors that Klebold and Harris were part of the Trenchcoat Mafia and listened to Marilyn Manson are the rumors that they were goths. While I can see how they fit some of the criteria, dark clothing, a depressive and dark attitude, and for Klebold being a fan of 9 Inch Nails, those are things that any kid could be into, and there's no real evidence that Klebold or Harris ever identified with the goth subculture. In fact, it's kind of funny to me that the media even reported this. Goths are, after all, well known for being visually expressive, and aside from the Black Dusters, Dylan, and especially Eric, don't look that different from your average 90s high schooler. It just goes to show you that's what happens when you get your information from random people at Columbine who are pretty much playing telephone, making up more and more wild stories about Eric and Dylan after they died.
They like to say that they're bisexual and are proud of it. They practice satanic rituals, I believe.
Who said yes? Speaking of stories, one of the most enduring Columbine myths concerns Rachel Scott and Kass 𝕮𝖆𝖊, 2 Christian girls who were shot in the massacre. The story goes that one of the shooters approached Kass 𝕮𝖆𝖊 and said, "Do you believe in God?" Cassie said, "Yes." The shooter said, "Then go be with him." Or it happened to Rachel Scott, as we can see recreated in the wonderfully factual I'm Not Ashamed.
Frank, go! Well, Rachel, where's your God now?
What would Jesus do?
Do you still believe in God?
You know I do.
Then go be with him.
The heartbreaking stories of these two young women dying for their faith spread like wildfire in the Christian community and led to the two becoming Christian martyrs. It also led to the dubious Rachel's Challenge, which is usually shown in schools as a presentation of Rachel's belief in Christianity and her code of ethics, which she wrote a month before her death. "Compassion is the greatest form of love humans have to offer," she'd said. The weird thing is that the kids of the presentation are pretty much told if they're in a situation where a shooter points a gun at their head and asks them if they believe in God, they should die for their faith, just like Rachel. If you're feeling like the whole "then go be with him" quote is too movie-like to be real, you'd be correct. Neither Rachel Scott nor Cassie Bernal were asked about their faith before they died. It was actually 𝕮𝖊𝖊𝖊𝖐𝖚. She'd been shot 9 times and fallen on the floor of the library, bleeding and screaming. You can hear her in this excerpt from hall monitor Patty Nelson's 911 call.
Because that's the kids getting killed.
According to most witnesses, Klebold had walked off, but when he heard her screaming, he came back and said, "Do you believe in God?" She hesitated, saying yes, no, then finally saying yes. He asked, "Why?" She said, "Because I believe, and that's how my parents raised me." Klebold said, "God is gay." He reloaded his gun and didn't shoot her again. Though she had life-threatening injuries, 𝕮𝖊𝖊𝖊𝖐𝖚 survived. It's interesting to me the Christian community didn't want to pick up on this story, since it's probably better for their propaganda. I can just imagine them coming up with stories like the devil in the shooter was scared by the angel of God and that's why 𝕮𝖊𝖊𝖊𝖐𝖚 survived, or whatever. But to be honest, it's hard to turn a living person into a glorified figure, especially if it's against their wishes. And despite the Christian community, and even Cassie Bernal's parents to some extent, getting angry when the real story came out, 𝕮𝖊𝖊𝖊𝖐𝖚 seemed to take things in stride. As she said a few months after the massacre, "The last thing I want is for someone to call me a hero. I don't want to be famous or get any title. I just want to live my life and be me." Interestingly, the Bernals were told by investigators that the "she said yes" story was a myth not long after the massacre, but they continued to perpetuate it, even writing a book called "She Said Yes: The Unlikely Martyrdom of Cassie Bernal," which was a top 10 bestseller. Whatever gets you through the night, I suppose. After all, the real story of Cassie Bernal is pretty damn horrifying. Peekaboo. When Klebold and Harris came into the library guns blazing, no one was prepared. Patty Nelson, the school staff in the room, told all the kids to get under the tables. It probably seemed like a good idea at the time, but it actually made the kids kind of like sitting ducks. Klebold and Harris were just shooting under tables without even looking. When Eric came to the desk where Cassie and another girl, Emily Wyant, were hiding, he slammed on it twice, likely to scare them, and peered down at the frightened girls. Cassie Bernal was hiding her face with her hands, probably because people were getting shot and dying all around her, and Eric taunted, "Peekaboo," before blasting her with his sawed-off shotgun straight in the face. She died instantly. Late entry of SWAT team and police. One thing that sets Columbine apart from other school shootings is how fucking long it was. Most school shootings succeeding it lasted only a matter of minutes before police arrived. Well, a lot of that is in direct response to what happened at Columbine, where SWAT and police, despite being called multiple times, and despite multiple officers from Jefferson County arriving on the scene at around 11:30, just 10 minutes after the shooting started, the massacre was allowed to carry on for almost an hour and could have gone on even longer if the perpetrators didn't kill themselves. This is even while desperate 911 calls kept coming in, and Dave Sanders, a coach at Columbine, was bleeding to death because he wasn't transported to the hospital in time. The reason for the delay is that police and SWAT were following standard procedures for the time. You were supposed to surround the building, set up a perimeter, and contain the damage. Well, they sure contained the damage alright. It wasn't until 2:30, 2.5 hours after the shooters had killed themselves, that SWAT was finally forced into action when Patrick Ireland, the famous boy in the window, crawled, dazed and bleeding, to the library window and tried to roll himself out. If SWAT did nothing now, the boy would die from the impact of the fall, so they helped him down. This iconic image is from that moment. By 2:40, SWAT had finally reached Coach Saunders. Students had done their best to keep him alive, trying to keep him awake by showing him pictures of his family. They'd even made a makeshift gurney to try to roll him out of the school, which SWAT refused to allow them to do, instead waiting 20 to 30 additional minutes for a paramedic to look at him, only for the paramedic to declare him dead. Needless to say, no one was thrilled about how the responders responded. It felt like everyone who was saved had to save themselves. Check out this news clip from the time. SWAT honestly sounds embarrassed and defensive.
But now there's a haunting question. Could the SWAT team have saved more lives?
Why didn't you go in there sooner?
I think because we didn't want to lose no more lives at that point.
Somebody suggests then that you guys were out there hiding behind your truck, waiting for the smoke to clear.
Yeah, I'd like them to come see me. They can pin on this badge, put on that tack jacket, and I'll stick a rifle in their hand and put them back in that scenario. See what they do.
Oh sure, comparing an untrained citizen with officers who literally signed up and trained for years for this dangerous job. Fuck outta here, guy. Yearbook 1999. The Columbine Yearbook of 1999 is slightly infamous for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, it was the year of the deadliest high school massacre in US history at the time. Two, it contains some pictures of Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, which were removed, most notably this picture of Eric with a description that reads, "Casually strolling to class, senior Eric Harris sports the classic all-black look, adding his personal touch with sunglasses and a sports watch. Watches were a necessity for students who led busy lives and had to keep track of appointments and important dates and their schedules. This badly rendered scan is all that remains of the photo." Possibly the weirdest entry to look at in hindsight is one by Nathan Dykman. He writes, "High school has been the best of times and the worst of times, but through it all, two guys have been with me. Thanks for the memories and everlasting friendship, Dylan and Eric." But the most controversial thing about the yearbook was the decision to keep the killer's photos included.
At first glance, the Columbine High School yearbook appears normal, but then you realize the pictures of the gunmen remain in the annual, and there's been two special inserts, one containing pictures of the 13 shooting victims. The yearbook was completed in February, and there was time to omit the gunmen's pictures, but the school's yearbook club decided to go ahead with the original version. While some students are upset, others understand.
We're just one big happy family school, and it's sad of what happened, and it's terrible, but you shouldn't just X them out of the yearbook. I mean, they're humans.
Ah, sure you were one big happy family. Sure you were. There was no such controversy at the 1999 graduation, however. Klebold and Harris were never mentioned, not even as posthumous graduates, as were senior-age victims Isaiah Scholes and Lauren Townsend. This makes total sense. After all, if Harris and Klebold had lived, even if they completely failed in the massacre and didn't take any lives or injure anyone, they no doubt would have been permanently expelled for their actions. It's a bittersweet punishment, though. I mean, who cares about a graduation ceremony when you're on the cover of Time magazine? If it weren't for what they did, no one would probably even know about the Columbine graduates of 1999 except their families. The reason most people even find out about them now is through the massacre, and Klebold and Harris are likely the most famous students to ever attend the school. It's weird how the media does things like that. Memorials. Columbine's library, where most of the carnage took place, looked ghastly by the end of the massacre. There was blood everywhere, and pieces of Eric's brain were probably splattered on the books. It was apparently a thought of the school board to actually try to renovate the library, but luckily they found their senses and tore it down. The library that replaced it is called the Hope Columbine Memorial Library, which still stands today. There's an additional memorial in Clemont Park, just behind the school, where a ring of remembrance and a wall of healing with personal quotes from the victims and their families are. Even at the memorial, though, you can't get away from assholes. In November of 2020, someone stole the donation box which funds the maintenance of the memorial. Luckily, they also take donations online, so hopefully it wasn't too big of a loss. Blow off your goddamn head.
I don't care what you say. If you ever touch him again, I will freaking kill you. I'm gonna pull out a goddamn shotgun and blow your damn head off. Do you understand, you little worthless piece of crap?
This is a line from Klebold and Harris's now infamous Hitman for Hire video, a project they did for school. Hitman for Hire, despite being one of the more lackluster films in existence, even for high school, was a real hit with the media because of its uncanny resemblance to the massacre. Dylan and Eric played as a hitman who ran a business taking out the bullies of the weak kids at school. At the end of the film, the hitmen decide the kid who hired them is pretty pathetic too, and they decide to kill him also. While it sounds a bit crazy, and a bit like maybe the school should have gotten suspicious, it was written as a sequel to a play other students had written. So basically, the school was pretty chill when it came to stuff like that, and Dylan and Eric's movie was just like any other to them. If you look at documentaries on Columbine or news reports, you'll nearly always see hitmen for hire used as some kind of evidence of the guy's violence and aggression, but I think that's a stretch so extreme it's almost hilarious. Yeah, if you edit them together at certain parts, they look full of rage, but if you see the full video, you can tell that no one's taking it that seriously.
No, you goddamn little bitch-ass piece of shit! Do not! God damn it.